In just 13 years, Alexander carved the largest empire the world had ever seen. Despite Alexander's meteoric rise and great conquests, it's his death and succession that's looked upon with most scrutiny. General history teaches us that when Alexander died, his empire fractured into successor states ran by his generals, known as diadochi. Some names that might come to mind would be the Seleucids, Antigonids, and even Ptolemies of Egypt, the dynasty of the famed Cleopatra. Although this is true to an extent, it doesn't depict the whole story. As one could imagine, the Argead Macedonian kingdom that Alexander ruled persisted as an institution for years after his death, and the diadochi wouldn't actually be proclaimed kings of their respective realms until 305 BC. Meaning, with Alexander's death, the institution persisted for 18 years, including the reign of his little-known older half-brother, Philip III Arrhidaeus. Philip III would rule as king of the Macedonians from 323 to 317 BC for a little bit over 6 years. Upon the death of Alexander, his generals were faced with a succession crisis. Alexander had not declared an heir. You, the viewer, may be thinking, well, why does this matter? His older brother is alive, so the succession should be clear. Alas, as expected, history is never as clean as it should be. Alexander's older brother was not an outright obvious pick due to being mentally disabled. Philip was not born with a mental disability, but instead it is believed to have developed over his childhood. Greco-Roman historian Plutarch from the 1st century AD claims that Philip got his mental disability due to a botched assassination attempt by his stepmother Olympias. Olympias was the mother of Alexander the Great. Plutarch believes Olympias had a motive to eliminate Philip, as he was the older brother of her own son Alexander, and thus outranked him in succession. Many modern historians refute Plutarch's claim, but despite this, they've provided zero potential alternatives to Plutarch's explanation. Plutarch's claim does seem to have some substance, as Alexander and Olympias viewed Philip as enough of a threat to succession to block a betrothal between Philip and the daughter of the Persian satrap of Lydia, Pixodarus, in 337 BC. Additionally, Alexander's father, Philip II, was extremely agitated with Alexander and his mother Olympias for blocking the marriage. There is additional, even more compelling evidence supporting Plutarch's theory, which will be covered later in the video. Nonetheless, until the death of Alexander, historians are fairly uncertain on where Philip Arrhidaeus exactly was. Some historians have postulated that Alexander was fond of his older brother, and Arrhidaeus traveled with Alexander during the latter's campaigns. There does seem to be some circumstantial evidence supporting Arrhidaeus tagging along with Alexander in some regard, as he was present in Babylon the day of Alexander's death, June 10th, 323 BC. Immediately following his brother's death, Philip Arrhidaeus was thrown into the middle of chaos. Many in the Macedonian court felt that Arrhidaeus was the most obvious candidate, while others believed that his mental disability posed too great of an issue. Complicating the situation, Alexander's widow Roxana, a Sogdo-Bactrian princess from what is now modern-day Afghanistan and Tajikistan, was pregnant with Alexander's child. One of Alexander's generals, Perdiccas, general of the cavalry, supported having the empire be ruled by the council of officers until Roxana gives birth, to see if she would have a posthumous son. Another one of Alexander's generals, Meleager, commander of the phalanx, believed that either Arrhidaeus or Alexander's illegitimate son, Heracles, should serve as king. The two sides ultimately reached a compromise where Arrhidaeus would be crowned as king of Macedon, pharaoh of Egypt, and king of kings of the Persian Empire as Philip III, with the contingency that if the child that Roxana gives birth to is a boy, that boy will serve as his co-ruler. From the beginning, the Council of Officers stated that Philip would reign but not rule over the empire. Instead, Perdiccas and Meleager would serve as Philip's regents, controlling all real functions of state. Roxana gave birth to a son in late 323 or early 322 BC named Alexander, meaning Perdiccas' bet had cashed in. Following this, most of the generals began recognizing Perdiccas as the senior regent. Unsurprisingly, Meleager was politically outmaneuvered and executed shortly after, later that year, on the orders of Perdiccas. Perdiccas fulfilled his promise and elevated Alexander's posthumous son as Alexander IV, king of Macedon. Upon hearing of Philip III's ascension to the throne, Alexander the Great's sister, Kinani, wanted to marry her daughter, Eurydice, to Philip, meaning yes, Eurydice was Philip's niece. This was seen as an obvious affront to Perdiccas, as it was sought after completely without his approval. As a result, Perdiccas ordered Kinani to be murdered. Fortunately, his men were disgusted by this murder, and Perdiccas relented, allowing the marriage to go through. Although under the regency of Perdiccas, for the remainder of his reign, Philip III would be under the control of his wife Eurydice, an ambitious woman who he legitimately trusted and cared for. Eurydice would spend her time as queen, trying to free her husband from the influence of military regents. In 321 BC, following the First War of the Diadochi, where former regent Perdiccas was murdered by his own troops, the Diadochi appointed Python and a man also named Arrhidaeus to serve as Philip's co-regents. Through the intelligent political maneuvering of Eurydice, she managed to have both regents removed in 320 BC. Despite her valiant effort, another general named Antipater would seize upon the power vacuum and install himself as Philip's regent. Antipater would then forcibly relocate Philip and Eurydice back to Macedonia. He would die only 1 year later in 319 BC from natural causes. Antipater would declare his close friend and general Polyperchon as his successor, spurring his own son Cassander of any recognition. Cassander fought against this inheritance, igniting the Second War of the Diadochi. In 317 BC, Cassander managed to expel Polyperchon from Macedonia, ending Polyperchon's 3-year regency over Philip. Shortly thereafter, Eurydice formed an alliance with Cassander. She simultaneously pressured Philip to nominate Cassander as his regent, which he did that same year. In exchange, Cassander made Eurydice a regent later that year when he departed to reconquer Greece. In the background of all this, the ever-present looming threat of Olympias, the very threat that may have given Philip his mental disability to begin with, was plotting on his downfall. Olympias had formed an alliance with the king of Epirus, her cousin, Eurydice. Olympias believed that if Cassander and Eurydice were victorious, that they would disinherit her grandson Alexander IV, son of Roxana and Alexander the Great. Thus, she and Eurydice invaded Macedonia in late 317, and unfortunately for Philip and Eurydice, the Macedonian army refused to fight the mother of Alexander the Great. Philip and Eurydice were found at Amphipolis and imprisoned together in a tiny cell. The two were subjected to starvation, and the general population began feeling extremely sympathetic towards the couple. Historian Diodorus claims that Olympias gave Eurydice a choice. She sent a sword, rope, and cup of hemlock to the couple's cell. Eurydice was to take her own life, but instead, she defied Olympias, gaining her even greater sympathy amongst the general public. Seeing the couple as far too dangerous to her power, Olympias ordered Philip to be executed. Eurydice would take her own life shortly after with her own girdle rather than any of the instruments sent by Olympias. This ended Philip's 6-year-long reign filled with lies, sorrow, and personal suffering. Many scholars argued that Olympias was then ousted from power due to the Macedonian people's disgust with her actions. Upon Cassander's return to Macedonia in early 316 BC, he tracked down and found Olympias and ordered her to be executed. Cassander's troops refused to kill the mother of Alexander the Great, though. Thus, Cassander left the punishment up to Olympia's many political victims. Ultimately, the families of her victims stoned her to death, and Cassander denied her any funeral rites. She would not be buried in the Macedonian royal tomb. Cassander would then order a splendid funeral for Philip and his wife Eurydice in the capital, burying the couple in the Macedonian royal tomb. In 1977, the second chamber of the Macedonian royal tomb was discovered. There is a hotly contested debate between scholars right now on whether or not that tomb is the tomb of Alexander the Great's father, Philip II, or his older brother, Philip III. It is difficult, as both men's wives had the name Eurydice as well. There is some information to suggest that Philip II is actually buried in Tomb 1, meaning that Tomb 2 would be Philip III. This could mean that we've discovered the tomb and potential artifacts of Alexander's tragic older brother, Philip III Arrhidaeus. Ultimately, Philip Arrhidaeus' story is a tragic one. He was a loyal husband to Eurydice and loyal brother to Alexander. Even with a mental disability, he was still used as a pawn in the games of the Macedonian political class. Hopefully, his story serves as an example of the tragedy that great power can bring to a family. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you'd like to leave a suggestion, please leave it in the comment section down below.